Hey, we're going to begin our series looking at the Easter story, the journey of Jesus towards the cross and to his resurrection and out of the tomb. And what we're going to do is look at that story in four particular acts: Jesus' rejection, his arrest, his death, and then his resurrection. And so this week we're going to think about Jesus' rejection. And I want to share from two particular passages. And we're going to get a bit of a narrative account from the one of them, and then a sort of theological interpretation from John in the second. So if you've got your Bibles there with you, if you can turn to Luke chapter 22, verses 1 to 6, and we're going to read from there. I've got a couple of things to share with you from that narrative account. And then we'll look to John's theological sort of understanding of what's really going on in this narrative here. This is from Luke's Gospel, chapter 22. It says, "Now the feast of unleavened bread drew near, which is called the Passover. And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death, for they feared the people. Then Satan entered into Judas called Iscariot, who was of the number of the 12. He went away and conferred with the chief priests and officers how he might betray him to them. And they were glad and agreed to give him money. So he consented and sought an opportunity to betray him to them in the absence of a crowd." I don't know whether you may have noticed, but you, perhaps like me, you've been sort of hooked to the news for quite a lot of the week. And of course, you know, the story that's really dominating is of course coronavirus. But one of the interesting things is that one of the very few sort of other stories, because there's no other sport or anything much else to talk about hugely, but one sort of stories that does remain, that does seem to still be being covered by newspapers and everything else, are the sort of scandalous celebrity stories. And one of them, I never read the details of the story, but one of them was about how an argument between Kanye West and Kim Kardashian and Taylor Swift, and how a video that's sort of been leaked now might prove that Taylor Swift was sort of right all along. One of the interesting things I thought from that is I didn't read the story. I dare say I would be not in the least bit interested. But I thought that it was interesting that scandal still sells. Even in a time where barely anything else really does and registers with people, there's still a place of a good scandal. And the Easter story is a story really of scandal. It's a story of betrayal, rejection, conspiracy to commit murder by the religious leaders. It's a story of scandal. And we see the first part of that as we think today on Jesus' rejection. And that's what we have described for us by Luke here in these verses, that Jesus is rejected. Some words from a clinical psychologist named Guy Winch. You may possibly have come across him from TED Talks. He's done a couple. He says this, talking about rejection: "Rejections are the most common emotional wound we sustain in daily life. Our risk of rejection used to be limited by the size of our immediate social circle or dating pools. Today, thanks to electronic communications, social media platforms, and dating apps, each of us is connected to thousands of people, any of whom might ignore our posts, chats, texts, or dating profiles and leave us feeling rejected as a result. In addition to these kinds of minor rejections, we're still vulnerable to serious and more devastating rejections as well. When our spouse leaves us, when we get fired from our jobs, snubbed by our friends, or ostracized by our families and communities for our lifestyle choices, the pain we feel can be absolutely paralyzing. Whether the rejection we experience is large or small, one thing remains constant. It always hurts, and it usually hurts more than we expect it to." And so what we'll see here is the rejection of Jesus. It may be surprising in some ways to think that Jesus, the Son of God, God himself, and we're going to see that John's saying that that's who Jesus is, would be rejected. And yet that's the beginning, really, of that journey to the cross, is Jesus' rejection. And so firstly, I want to point out here the rejection of Jesus here in Luke chapter 22, that number one, the chief priests orchestrate his death. It says here in verse 1, "The feast of unleavened bread drew near." Why now? Why then? What's significant about that for them? Well, it seems that we read here in verse 2 at the end of it that they feared the people. And the two things connect: the timing and the motivation. The timing, the feast, the motivation, fear of the crowd. It seems that in their hearts they feared that Jesus, who in his ministry had been so unbelievably popular. I mean, one of the themes that Mark gets across in his gospel right from the very beginning is how Jesus' fame just absolutely snowballs out of control. And even though Jesus actually is not intentionally trying to pursue that. In fact, to the contrary, Jesus seems to be trying to make himself not famous. He's constantly withdrawing. He's constantly, refusing opportunities to just get a cheap crowd and cheap heat. And yet, people are just following him, even though actually he's encouraging people to not follow him. He's saying after feeding 5,000, and he has this huge crowd following him, look, you only follow me because of the bread. You think that you follow me and you're just going to get fed again. If that's what it is, just go. And yet the fame just keeps going and the people love him. And one of the things that people have said is that we haven't heard teaching like this before. He teaches with authority, not like the scribes and the Pharisees. They fear him. They fear the crowd. And they fear, I think, that at this feast time, somehow the crowd might seek to push Jesus forward and that might threaten their position. And so the feast time is approaching and they fear and they sense that this is the moment to try to dispose of Jesus. It says here, verse 2, and this is worth looking at here, the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to put him to death. There's two parts of that sentence to really take in. That first bit there, the chief priests and the scribes. Let that sink in. The religious leaders. They're the ones who are seeking to have Jesus killed. That should be shocking. That should be scandalous. That should be a surprise. It should be unthinkable that religion would lead you to do that. And yet we know that religion can be quite toxic on occasions. And so it proves here with Jesus himself. The religious leaders seek to put him to death. That's the first thing. Secondly, they're seeking how to put him to death. This is not a crime of passion. This is not a spur of the moment. I lost control in one moment and did something that I wouldn't normally. I lost control of myself and couldn't contain my emotions. No, this is premeditated murder. This has been planned. They have put great thought and concentration and strategy into having Jesus killed. It's not a crime of passion. It's premeditated murder. They're seeking how to put him to death. We see this plot play out. It's a plot that really has begun from very early on in the ministry of Jesus. The religious leaders are the ones really who've taken the offence to him and sought to undermine him and sought eventually even to put him to death because of a sense of him threatening their position and their place within the society at the time. And we see this plot play out even from very early on in the Gospels. In Mark's Gospel, we see this in chapter 2, verse 8. We see them beginning to question him, in their hearts at least, as he's healing the paralytic, and Jesus will speak into it. We say, why is it that you question in your heart that I can do this? But so that you know that I can forgive sins as well, I tell you, pick up your mat and walk too, so that you can know that I can do the both. And in knowing that, so that you can know that I'm God. Only God could forgive sins. Only God could heal this man like this. But they're questioning in their heart. They begin to question openly. Mark chapter 2, verses 16 and 18. We see them asking, why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners? And it becomes an offensive term from him that Jesus is a friend of sinners. Jesus doesn't take it as offensive. Because he said, I haven't come for the well. I've come for those who are broken. I've come for those who are ill. I've come for those who need a physician. I've come for sinners. Yes, I'm a friend of sinners. But they're questioning him about that. They're questioning him also about fasting. Why is it that John's disciples and the Pharisees fast, but your disciples don't? Why are you less religiously observant than us? They're already questioning him openly. They begin to accuse him, even in the same chapter there, verse 24. They question him about breaking the Sabbath. Why are you seemingly allowing your disciples to break the Sabbath? And Jesus will say, well, I'm the Lord of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for me. I'll decide and define what happens on the Sabbath because it's about actually worshipping me, being restored and renewed and refreshed by me on that day. It's not just about ticking a box on the rules, but they're questioning him. We hear in Mark chapter 3 verse 2 that they're looking for a chance to accuse him. They're looking to see whether he'll heal someone on the Sabbath. Well, now you're working. You can speak, you can preach, but now if you start healing someone like that physically, you're working and you're breaking the Sabbath. And they're looking for a chance to accuse him. And we see them by chapter 3, verse 6, beginning to plot with the Herodians how they can have Jesus killed. So the plot has been an ongoing one. It's been premeditated, and we've seen that throughout the course of the Gospels. We see them discrediting him as well in chapter 3 of Mark's Gospel too, saying, he's only able to deliver people from demonic powers by a demon. He's powered by Beelzebub, not God. They're discrediting him, they're questioning him, they're accusing him, they're plotting to have him killed right from very, very early on. It's a premeditated crime. And Luke's clear here about who's at fault. Firstly, it's the religious elite. Out of envy, out of fear of him and the crowd who follow him, the religious leaders put Jesus to death. But secondly, they're not the only ones responsible that Luke gives here, because this rejection is much more personal too. It's not just about the religious elite. It's a rejection from without, from the religious leaders, from those not within Jesus' circle, but it's also a rejection that comes even from within his small circle of closest followers. Secondly, there's Judas's betrayal. And in Judas's betrayal, we see two things. We see a human action and a satanic prompting. We see the combination of both the human action and responsibility, but also a satanic prompting going on within him. It says here, verse 3, Satan entered into Judas, who was of the number of the 12. It's a confluence of both human work and Satan working. So that Judas isn't a victim. He's not someone to feel sorry for. I think there's a tendency, perhaps especially in kind of British culture, to really sort of value the underdog. You root for the one who seems to be weaker, who seems to have less resources. That's always the person that you pull for. Judas isn't some underdog who somehow got landed with a terrible job where it was a poison chalice. He was always going to do it. He had no way out of it. And really he's just the poor guy who winds up doing the job that somebody had to be the one doing. Judas isn't a victim. Judas isn't a victim. Though Satan enters him and influences him, Judas does what he wants to do. Judas betrays Jesus because he wants to, and he must take the responsibility for that. But there's an influence from Satan there. I think a lot of our theology about Satan actually can be really unhelpful. Especially if you think of many of the images that we sort of have of him, of Satan being this sort of, in a red PVC sort of cat suit with the tail and the pitchfork. And, he's the one who's there in hell with a sort of saloon bar. And, this is where sort of all the rebellious kind of cool people are. A lot of that imagery is incredibly unhelpful for us, and it makes him into a cartoon character that, of course, is very, very difficult to believe in. The reality of Satan is is so much different to that. In fact, actually, oddly enough, one of the greatest sort of bits of theology on Satan, I think, actually, oddly, comes from a Rolling Stones song, which in turn comes from a Russian novel called The Master and Margarita, in which Satan is pictured as a sort of this exotic, sort of well-read foreigner who just kind of sidles along beside people in key moments in their life. And it pictures Satan coming alongside Pilate and many other characters and just being there and just being a sort of subtle influence in the moment to go a certain way. In the song Sympathy for the Devil, it sort of highlights some of this. I want to read some of the lyrics for you that show this. It says, I was round when Jesus Christ had his moment of doubt and pain, made sure that Pilate washed his hands and sealed his fate. I stuck around St. Petersburg when I saw it was a time for a change. Killed the Tsar and his ministers, Anastasia screamed in vain. I rode a tank, held a general's rank, when the blitzkrieg raged and the bodies stank. Pleased to meet you, hope you guess my name, because what's puzzling you is the nature of my game. So if you meet me, have some courtesy, have some sympathy, and some taste. The whole idea through it, he'll say as well, I shouted out who killed the Kennedys when after all, it was you and me. The whole idea is, here is Satan subtly working in the background of human action. There's that same combination. Satan entered into Judas, and Judas does what he does. It's good theology because it's the same thing here, actually. It's that Satan is there prompting and nudging and cajoling, and people are doing what they're doing. So that he's there, he's involved, he's orchestrating. But that's not without genuine human action that carries responsibility to it. Satan enters into Judas, but he's no victim. There's two reasons, actually, that we find out why Judas would do this. Because the natural question is to ask, Judas, why would you do this? Why would you sell out your friend? Why would you sell out someone who has done so much good and is so good? Why would you sell him out? We get given two reasons. You can read them in Mark chapter 14 if you want to. But on the surface, the reason is he wants the money. He wants the money. There's a story in Mark chapter 14 where a woman comes to Jesus and in her brokenness and in her worship and her adoration of Jesus, breaks this expensive sort of family heirloom of perfume over him and anoints him. And it's a wonderful moment of her love and her compassion, and it embodied in a moment. And it's a touching and beautiful moment. And Judas doesn't like it. And John tells us later on in his gospel that was because he was the treasurer and he had the money bags and he used to help himself from the money bags. And so he turns around and says, why was this lavish, extravagant thing done? Jesus, you should have stopped it and we should have just sold the perfume. We could have given the money to the poor. He doesn't mean that. What he means is, I could have taken my share from it. But he'll hide it under a veil and a veneer of charity to others. But it's really about his own heart. The surface reason is the money. But the deeper reason is that Judas has already rejected Jesus. What the woman was doing in her wonderful sort of act of worship was recognizing that Jesus was God. She was recognizing that in the way that she best knew. Maybe she felt she couldn't have put it in words, but could put it in an action. That this really expensive, precious family heirloom she could use to anoint him and to recognize and to show her love and her worship for him and recognition that he's not just a good man, he's God. And I want to recognize him as such and anoint him before others. Judas doesn't like it because he doesn't see Jesus as God. We know that again from John's account later on. The account of Jesus talking with his friends in John chapter 6 and saying, there are some among you who don't believe. And he's talking of Judas, of course. There, within that small crowd was one who already was turning away from Jesus, despite having seen all the works of Jesus and seen his miracles and seen his pattern of life and seen him never sin, but only ever do what was good, right, and perfect, and be so gracious and generous and compassionate and merciful to all kinds of people that society would have written off. Judas is already turning away from him. The surface reason is the money, but underneath it is that he just simply has already rejected Jesus a long time ago, and now Satan has entered in and prompted him to finally sell him out. It says he went away and conferred with the chief priests. He's proactive. Judas goes and does it. Goes and confers with the chief priests. It's premeditated, like it was for the chief priests. It's not a crime of passion. It's not one moment in which Judas fails. He's put thought into this. It's more scandalous. His friend really has turned on him. At verse 5 it says they were glad and agreed to give him money. Verse 6, so Judas conspires to find a way to hand Jesus over in the absence of a crowd. They're eager to be able to get rid of Jesus as quickly as they can, but they're very aware of how they may come across. They still fear the crowd and they don't want to look bad. That's the essence of religiosity, really, isn't it? That you want to look good in front of others. You always want to look to be doing the right thing. You always want to be looked to be saying the right thing, feeling the right thing, whether you feel it or not. What happens is appearance is better than reality. You value your appearance more than who you actually are. It matters more how people see me to be than how I really am. So they look for a way to kill him without a crowd. So we get a narrative account here of some of the rejection of Jesus here. In fact, actually, there's many more elements to it. In Mark's account, he, after the meal that they share on the Passover, is really eager to show how all of them end up departing from Jesus. All of them end up fleeing. Once he's arrested, they all end up going, making the point that actually, do you know, all of his friends actually desert him at some point. And Peter denies him 3 times. Jesus is rejected. But John gives us a fascinating theological insight into what's really going on. What is God doing through this? Here we have the description of some of what happens. But now John will give us a bit of an insight to, well, what is God doing and how do we make sense of Jesus, God himself, being rejected? So I want to encourage you to turn to John chapter 1. And we'll read just a few verses from there and look at how John describes and explains what's going on here. This is John chapter 1 from verse 9 to 18. It says here, the true light which gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world and the world was made through him, yet the world did not know him. He came to his own and his own people did not receive him, but to all who did receive him, who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, who were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God. And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. And we've seen his glory, glory as of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. John bore witness about him and cried out, this was he of whom I said, he who comes after me ranks before me, because he was before me. For from his fullness we've all received grace upon grace. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. He has made him known. And John gives us this wonderful theological insight now into, well, what is happening? What is God's plan here in Jesus being rejected? How do we make sense of it? We're given the account of it happening. But now, how do we make sense of what's going on here? And the first thing we see here, verses 9 to 13, is that there's this mixed reaction to Jesus. It says the true light is coming into the world. It's the true light of the first few verses there of John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. The Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. That light, that word from the beginning, it's a sort of metaphorical way of saying God in the beginning, who was with God, the Father, and was God alongside him, who, through him everything was made. And we know that's the case because in Genesis we read of God saying, let us make man in our image. This light, who was that? Who shines and overcomes the darkness, was coming into the world. And John wants to make a really simple but really important point here of how, and you notice it that even, John doesn't have a genealogy to Jesus. He doesn't have a family tree. The other Gospels kind of begin with a bit of a family tree of where Jesus is from, and they're all wanting to say different things about him by the way in which they show his lineage. John wants to say something by not having a lineage, other than to say he was God in the beginning. He wants to say he was never created. He always was. But when he's come to earth, he's been wrapped in flesh. Jesus isn't born in Bethlehem. He already was. But he becomes human in Bethlehem. But there's a mixed reaction to him. We live in the darkness. We know that at this moment. We know there's a darkness over the earth as we struggle with the battle to contain and try to suppress the coronavirus. And not just the virus, but then the really difficult political and economic realities of dealing with that and having to shut so many things down. We live in a real darkness with real uncertainty in some of the days ahead. And I think there's a heaviness over many parts of the earth. And we stand awaiting light. And for the people in Jesus' day, they're in a darkness. And for them, the darkness is that as the people of Israel are completely, overrun by the Romans, and they're hoping and looking towards a day in which they can finally have their independence back, have their freedom, be free to express who they are fully, and just have a prosperity rather than, all of their kind of wealth just going to Rome in huge taxes. They're living in a darkness and looking for light. And yet the promise here is not that the light will overcome that darkness. But primarily, that's not the main message. Actually, the main message is that Jesus is the light that shines in the darkness of the sin that wraps the world, that causes death, decay, and destruction. That the light comes to overcome the darkness and despair of sin, that causes all of the despair and dysfunction that we see around us. It comes to sort out the real fundamental problem underneath our initial immediate circumstances. The lights come and it overcomes the darkness. It says verse 10 here that he was in the world and the world was made through him. We were told that in verse 3 that we've just read. Yet the world didn't know him. So what's the problem? How does the world not know him? He's in the world. He's made the world. Nothing that's in the world has life without him. How do they not know him? The problem here is not a lack of information. It's not that, God is so introverted that he's just not there. It's not that he's not there. It's not that there's not information. It's that people are ignorant. He is in the world, but the world did not know him. It says verse 11, he came to his own things, his own domain, his own people. And his own people, and listen to the wording of this, did not receive him. He's there. He's come. But they didn't receive him. The word in the Greek that is used to describe, the process of a transaction in a shop, of, passing over money and receiving it, accepting it. You know that, in certain shops, you go in with the wrong currency, they won't accept it. It's not acceptable for them. They're not going to receive it and accept it. You're not going to get that good in exchange. This is the idea, that Jesus is there in the world, amongst his own people, and they won't accept him. The problem isn't a lack of information. It's not God's introversion. It's ignorance. And it's also insolence. They won't accept him. They won't receive him. And so the message of the gospel always leaves us with this stark choice of whether or not we will accept or reject Jesus. That's what it hangs upon. Whether I will accept the revelation of God in Jesus or whether I will reject it. In verses 11 to 12 here, it sets up that there's always some amount of rejection of Jesus. There is always a mixed reaction. There's never an expectation, actually, that it's going to be a universal acceptance. There's always a mixed reaction. And while some reject him, he's come to the world, come to his own people, and his own people did not receive him. There's some hope here that verse 12, it says, to all who did receive him and believed him. And those two things, they're an important pair, receiving and believing. Just believing that he is who he says he is, that he is God. And that therefore what he says he's doing and will do and has done is true and is true for you. Believing that him living a perfect life, revealing the glory of God the Father, revealing what it looks like to follow God, to know him, to live in his blessing under his rule, dying in your place for your sin, giving you his righteousness, that you might be made clean and made just before him, that you might be able to walk into a new life, forgiven, restored, adopted as God's children, believing that that's really true, receiving it. It says that he gave the right to become children of God. That's one of the promises of the gospel, adoption, to become God's children. But then there's an important question. Because of who? Or because of what? What action has brought this about? Is it because of my belief and my receiving him? Is that what's done it? I've received and I believe, and that's why I'm made a child of God. Now, John's eager to point out, really, just be really clear about what it is that's caused this. Who's the one who gets the credit, gets the glory for this? Verse 13, children born not of blood. It's not about ethnicity. It's not that you're just born into this. That was one of the misunderstandings of the people of Israel before in the Old Testament, was that because you're simply born ethnically into Israel, then you're part of the people of God. But always the idea was not just about it being ethnicity, but it being about those who actually follow God. So one of the marks of that ethnic people of God there was circumcision. But even then, there's the clarification in the Old Testament. Look, it's not just about being circumcised outwardly. It's about you being circumcised inwardly. It's about you actually following God, not just ethnically being of this people. So it's children not born of blood. And it's not just about ethnicities. People from many nations and many different backgrounds. It's not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh. It's not that somehow in my humanity, I've got this part of me that's got this good will and desire that's sort of led me to it. So it's my good nature that's made me happen. My good nature that's a bit better than those who reject Jesus. No, not at all. Not at all. I'm no different. It's not of my own nature, nor my ethnicity. Thirdly, it's nor of the will of man. It's not about a human decision. And this is the way that Paul will put it as well in Romans 9 as well. That it's saying it's not about human will or exertion, but God who chooses. God's grace to us. Born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God. Elected, chosen, set apart by God in his grace. God, by his grace, elects to save those who receive him, those who believe, those who accept him. Not because of our ability, not because of our performance, not because of our nature, not because of any ethnicity, but despite all those things, despite all those things that might actually lead us to try to save ourselves, try to think we don't need saving. In grace, He looks past those things. He looks past my failure. He looks past my sin and my shame, and on the basis of Jesus' righteousness, saves me. So that his election, his choice for me, precedes and precipitates my belief, my acceptance. Do you see what I'm saying there? It precedes my belief, my acceptance. That is, it's not to say there isn't a huge part of us coming to faith and knowing Jesus and being saved, being part of his people, that is about an acceptance of Jesus and a belief. It absolutely requires that on my part. Say in the gospel that those who believe and who confess with their mouth that Jesus is Lord will be saved. That's important. It's crucial. But what it's saying is God's choice precedes that. It comes before. I'm able to make that response because of what God has graciously done within me first. It precedes it. God's election precedes my response, my faith, my belief, my acceptance. It's not that there isn't action there on my part, there is. But it comes because of what God has first done. And secondly, and I kind of already said it in a way, that God's election there, his work, precipitates, it causes my response. His work comes before, and his work causes me to respond to him by grace. Because if he didn't, then I wouldn't. But by his grace, he works within us, makes us children of God, born not of blood, not of the flesh, not of the will of man, but of the will of God. So that John will say in another place that we love because he has first loved us. It's another way of putting the same thing. And Jesus coming was always going to produce a sifting, that some would accept him and some would reject him. There's a mixed reaction, number one. And secondly, Jesus in coming like this, and what we see in John's theological sort of understanding of it here, is that Jesus was coming revealing God's glory. In verses 14 to 18 here, it says the word from verse 1 there, the word who was God and was with God in the beginning, became flesh. Jesus didn't become God. God became man in Jesus. That's a really significant difference, that Jesus isn't such a good man that he becomes God. He's such a good God that he becomes a man. That's a really huge, huge difference. That actually God comes down to us. It's not that he offers an example of how we might climb up to him. It's completely the reverse. It's he comes down to us because we couldn't possibly get up to him. The word became flesh. And it says, verse 14, he dwelt. The word could be, he set up his tent, he tabernacled among us. And we've seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son of the Father. You know, glory is such an important sort of theme that we see throughout the scripture. And just a few places here, let me just trace a few of the moments there for you that are significant. Exodus 40, verses 34 and 35. We see the glory of God descending here upon the tent of meeting, his presence there with him. It says, the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And Moses wasn't able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. We see this same glory being really the centerpiece of also the temple. In 1 Kings 8, verse 10, it says, when the priest came out of the holy place, a cloud filled the house of the Lord, so that the priest could not stand to minister because of the cloud, for glory of the Lord filled the house of the Lord. And yet, we see sadly in Ezekiel 11, verse 22, that the glory of the Lord leaves at a certain point. Actually, the people push God to the point that actually he takes his presence away from the place because they're using it as purely a transaction. They'll just come, do the rituals, get what they want, and go their own way. So it says, the cherubim lifted their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel was over them, and the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city. And yet, there's this wonderful promise towards the end of the Old Testament. Zechariah 2 verse 10, sing and rejoice, O daughter of Zion, for behold, I come and I'll dwell in your midst, declares the Lord. The glory is coming back. The presence of God is coming back. And religious life really, in the Old Testament, the centrifuge, the very middle of which everything else kind of goes around, is the glory of God, the presence of God. So all of the rituals really are about your access to God. Everything that has to happen before you can possibly even begin to get near to him, because he is so holy. To the point that even the priests have to have ropes around their legs when they go in to serve there, because they might just die on the spot and have to be pulled out. Everything is about the glory of God's presence there, and what you must do to be cleansed and forgiven to be able to be before the Lord. Jesus has revealed the glory of God, the kind of glory that only the Son from the Father, God himself, the heir of all things, could possibly reveal. Jesus brings the glory of the presence of God to us in himself. God comes to the people, not people coming to God. So it says here, John the Baptist, it is that John's talking about. It's a bit confusing. John writing, talking of John, he means John the Baptist, bore witness about him. And so he's linking Jesus to John as the messenger and the forerunner. And John's summary of him, that he ranks before me because he was before me. He ranks so much, he's so much better than me because he always was before me. He has no beginning. He's just simply now come in human flesh. Jesus destroys and confuses all other notions and pictures of glory. It says from his fullness, and the word could mean superabundance. From his superabundance we've received grace upon grace, a never-ending, never-exhausting supply of grace from the Lord Jesus. It says, verse 17, that the law was given through Moses, but grace and truth came through Jesus. Jesus is better than Moses. Religion and life under Moses in that old era, well, this is so much better now, knowing Jesus. The best that you could hope for in the Mosaic era was that Moses himself would be a bit affected for a time by the glory of God, and it would wear off. In Jesus, he brings the fullness of the glory of God, and it doesn't wear off. It's the glory that the only Son from the Father could reveal. Jesus is better than Moses. Why does John say this? Because one of the things that the religious leaders are saying to Jesus is, we had Moses, he's better. We'll stick to him. And John is making the case that no, Jesus is so much better. Stick with Jesus. Why on earth would you want to go back to those days? Why wouldn't we want to have fullness? And so John will say here, verse 18, and he'll finish up, that no one has ever seen God, the only God who is at the Father's side. Again, going back to verse 1, the Word who was with the Father in the beginning and was there. He has made him known. Jesus is better because, all the law could ever do was diagnose you. It could tell you what was wrong. But what it couldn't do was to ever cleanse you. It wouldn't make you clean. It would just tell you what's wrong with you. It couldn't make you clean. It couldn't acquit you. The law can't actually let you off. All it can do is tell you where you've broken the law when you've broken it. It can't acquit you. And thirdly, it can't change you. The law just simply diagnoses what you've done. It can't change you. And so people would keep coming with the same problems, the same sins, the same failures, with no hope. Jesus is better because he cleanses us. By dying in our place for our sins, offering his righteousness in exchange, he cleanses us. By dying in our place, paying the penalty that we deserve for the sin that we've committed and the judgment that we deserve to face, he acquits us. We can go free. And thirdly, because he replaces our old life, our old person, our old sin and our shame with his Spirit, he changes us to actually think and to act and to live differently. He's so much better than the law. And so no one has ever seen God, but the only God who is at the Father's side, he has made him known. So that the essence of Jesus' mission is to reveal what the Father looks like. And that if you want to know what God looks like and who he is, look to Jesus. Look to Jesus. He's the final word on what God looks like. Look to Jesus. You don't need to look any further or anywhere else than Jesus to know exactly what the Father is like, because he reveals all the Father's glory in his life. And yet, many reject him, despite him having done this. No lack of information, no introversion on God's part. He's there among them. But there's an ignorance, and there's an insolence. There's a refusal to accept him. The story here is not man being unfamiliar with a far-off God who just isn't there and isn't involved. It's much more scandalous. The story is of a gracious Father who has endured much sin and rebellion against him and the good world that he's created, and a people who have taken that world crashing down with them. And a good Father who has revealed himself fully in his Son and been willing to let go of his Son to come to earth, to live with us as one of us, to live a perfect life that we should have lived, but we can't, and we haven't, and we don't, so that he may give himself as a sacrifice in our place, that the judgment that we face for our sin, our rebellion, not just the things that we do, but the fact that every time we go against God, we're saying that he's wrong. We're saying that he's a liar. We're saying that he's holding out on us some good thing. We're saying he's not good. He's not right. He's not perfect. He doesn't know better. Jesus comes and dies that we would be forgiven, that we would be cleansed, that we would be made new, that we would have life. And yet, some still reject him. It's a scandalous story that a God who is so utterly, utterly good would still be rejected. And yet, in his grace, he leads some to see him for who he is in all his glory, and to believe, and to receive him, and to become children of God, and to receive new life. In his goodness and in his grace, he endures rejection that we might know him and that we might receive out of all of his goodness. It's a scandalous story, but it's a beautiful story of a God who is prepared to endure rejection in the course of pursuing us and saving us. And so we're encouraged to look to Jesus, to look to his fullness, and to receive him once again.